when you have, as Hillman presents us, a psychology of the gods, quote unquote, where the gods are not metaphysical entities so much as psychic realities, yet still point to something ultimate, then you get a psychology that hasn't split off from religion. And you could then say you get a religion that is sort of psychological. Now, maybe you call it a pagan religion, but I think it's better just to think of it as a religion of everyday experience.
Professor Glenn, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, it's really good to be back with you again, revisioning psychology. If anyone hasn't listened to our part one, where we covered the first two chapters, the first two big ideas of that book, you should go back and listen to that to have some background on what we're going to be discussing today. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me to draw out some of the more salient ideas of this text. As I was diving back into it over the past week or so, I was just struck once again by just how dense this book is with incredible ideas, like one after another. Like I had the same experience of trying to make notes, trying to highlight things, and it's pretty much the whole thing. And so it's a bit daunting and sometimes frustrating to find like a summary or a list of like bullet points of the most important ideas of this text. And so I was trying like different approaches to it. And one of the approaches that I found was interesting was just picking out the sentences that he had italicized.
Uh-huh. Hmm.
Yeah, and I'm going to go through the rest of the book and draw those out. I saw those as being like I could collect them kind of like Heraclitus's fragments, because I thought, well, if these are the things that he thought was most important, most salient, then they are kind of like breadcrumbs through this text, which just weaves through the history of the world, the history of psychology, mythology, religion. I mean, it's all in there.
Yes, I think most people have the same experience if they, at least if they cross that threshold into Hillman's style of imagining and are not put off by some of his sort of fierce pushbacks on traditional ideas, even in Jungian psychology. Um, I hear this over and over again that people do so much underlining that and end up with most of it underlined. But I do also feel like there are some nodules of understanding that we can extract and give us a point of orientation.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I'm feeling like fairly soon I'm going to try to get together a group to do a deep reading of the text and take it slowly, because there is so much in there and so much that will raise, I think, important discussions. Like you said, he comes through with such a force and energy in this text that he doesn't even have in later texts, I think. There was something about this where there was a concentration of his energy in producing these lectures that became the text. It just comes through so strongly. He makes these like declarative statements about soul, about archetypal psychology. Like he's really kind of defining his style or his area of
Mhm.
focus and distinguishing it from all others, which brings up some of that, some of the kind of more, I don't know, polemic statements that he's
Right.
known for and that can put people off if they don't work through it.
Yeah, and a big one is the timing. If you think of it, it's kind of conceived in the early 70s and put together as a text in 75 and based on these Terry lectures that he gave And one of the things that the book is obviously countering, because you mentioned how full of ideas it is the way in which psychology was seemingly going all into process and experiences. The whole Gestalt movement, the emergence of transpersonal psychology, Esalen, drug experiences. And so I think that was at least one of the things that he was trying to counter with this text.
Hmm. Yeah, he comes out. So we're gonna, in this conversation, we're gonna cover the last two chapters of the book. And
Mhm.
the third chapter is called Psychologizing or Seeing Through. And he comes right out at the beginning of that chapter with this statement. One aim of this book is the resuscitation of ideas at a time in psychology when they have fallen into decline and are being replaced by experimental designs, social programs, therapeutic techniques. So exactly what you're saying, there's kind of a reaction to what he saw as a kind of a dearth or poverty of psychological ideas, differentiated from other kinds of ideas, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think for people to just have an image to cotton onto that is to think of the ideas of depth psychology as your toolbox, and you start out with the basic ones, just the idea of the unconscious, for example. And then the notion of the unconscious of Freud, the repressed always returns, and Jung, the compensatory relationship between conscious and unconscious, and then it goes to there, and but the big storehouse of ideas for Hillman is, of course, stemming from the idea of the archetypal basis of mind and the notion that the archetypes are expressed first and foremost in through mythic figures. So we turn to the mythic figures. The idea of seeing through in archetypal psychology is very much about seeing through to underlying mythic structures and presences. That's the sort of I guess focus of the undertaking.
Hmm. Yeah, and he uses, he loves to coin these new terms, which are always a play on words or somehow twisting a well-known term, right? So psychologizing, differentiating it as an activity
Mhm.
of soul making. I wonder if you could just speak about psychologizing and what he means by that.
Well, he uh, wants to see our experiences the world in terms of the soul. And as we talked last time at the very beginning of this book, he defines soul itself as a perspective that in the first instance deepens, but it has these other qualities, religious significances, for example. He says that soul turns events into experiences. So I think when he uses the term psychologizing, and we remember psyche and soul are cognate, he's talking about how to create uh, perspectives, ways of seeing that have those soul qualities. And what I would underscore at the beginning is that seeing through psychologizing has two particular qualities that we can come back to again and again. It deepens, it as he says in the text, it moves from a more obvious to a less obvious understanding. Even that word understanding suggests depths, getting underneath something, to a to a hidden meaning, to an underlying metaphorical significance. But I think the other point is that it always opens our imagination.
Hmm.
So so psychologizing in terms of seeing through is not a reductive exercise. It's an exercise of, oh, if we think about it this way, what are the other possibilities? And that's important because the psyche just seems to be able to hold things much better if it has a richer imaginal field around, you know, a symptom or an overwhelming event or
Mhm.
whatever it is that you're looking at. The more you can imagine into it, the more you're able to kind of sit down psychologically and not just be all over the place.
Mm. Yeah, I think he refers to finding that deeper experience of an event or a symptom is where the soul is at rest, actually. Like the soul loves ambivalence,
Hmm.
right? One of the things comes right out and says, I think it's one of the subheadings, is that psychologizing has to do with moving through the literal to the metaphorical. So doing that move that you're talking about there.
Yeah, and the point here is, we're so trained in our scientific way of thinking to think we need an explanation and that's where things stop. But the soul is satisfied with the sense of deeper insight. So the one thing to get here is that the fantasy is not seeing through to some end point. The
Mm.
fantasy is seeing through to, as you say, a metaphor or something that's more satisfying. That's why when we read a great poem, we think of whatever aspect of life it's describing, and we just feel, oh, that's like just so deeply satisfying that just hits the nail on the head. That's the soul's sense of, well, that's enough for now. Of course, the poem, the metaphor, also opens to a whole series of other things. But I think that's one of the most important points here is that remember the overall project here is to increase the sense of soul or to do what Hillman calls soul making. And that doesn't have to do with like arriving at neat packaged explanations.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the ways that he does this move of differentiating archetypal psychology from other psychologies is that archetypal psychology makes the move from asking how or why,
Mhm.
right? Kind of like the why being um, why does this pattern exist in me? And
Mhm.
looking for that causal relationship to some early event in childhood, right? Something like
Mhm.
that. And
Mhm.
then the how is, well, how do I get rid of it?
Mhm.
Right? And so he says, no, instead we ask who
Mhm.
and what.
What? Right.
So from how or why to who and what. And that's interesting because that gets into personifying.
The who is very
Mm.
much in the personifying, and the what is the more phenomenological
Right. Like
angle.
what is happening? What is happening here? What is actually happening here?
Yes, what's this experience like? Because that's where the imagination then starts to pick up. When you begin to actually describe your anxiety or describe your depression, the seeing through process begins because you will reach for a metaphor. This feels like some huge, heavy garment I'm wearing all the time that I can't seem to get off. Well, isn't that interesting? Let's stay with that for a second. You see that's the soul's response to its own situation, and you can move with that. And it's both going to be particular to that person or that situation, and we'll see eventually you start working with the images and there's a more universal quality to the story too. But yeah, the whatness.
Yeah, I just caught that little subtlety that you said, like, what is this like? So we're into the realm of metaphor then. what's it like for you to have anxiety? And someone might say, well, it's like I have like bees buzzing around in my chest,
Mm.
or it's like I've got like ants crawling all over my skin, or something like that, right? Or
Yes.
he was an example somewhere where someone's talking about, this kind of like obsessive thinking, and they described it as like ants going around the ant hill. And it puts us in a different place and a different kind of attitude toward the symptoms or the events.
Yes, and particularly if, as we talked last time, we keep that idea of necessity in mind, that there's something from the soul's perspective, there's something necessary in the symptom. So then you stay with the image because you assume, well, there's something going on here that I'm not seeing deeply enough, that I'm not understanding.
Hmm. Hmm. That was great. He doesn't exclude his own theory from kind of analysis. He says, like all activities of the psyche, psychologizing has its shadow in a psychopathological exaggeration of paranoia. And that's something that I do think about sometimes when it comes to taking on a Hillmanian orientation in the work that I do with people. Like when I'm constantly like looking to see through and sticking with the metaphors and things like that. Maybe there's a fear that, well, I never get to the bottom of anything. It's always just this open-ended inquiry and exploration, and nothing ever gets resolved. And that could kind of make you a little crazy too, I think.
Uh, yes, but I tend to think that that's an outcome of the psychologizing that's maybe only being done in a half-hearted way, or it's not being done fully. So, we see, just for a point of contrast, a lot of paranoia occurring when there is no psychologizing, when there is no thinking in terms of the soul. Then it's like, oh yes, there's always some kind of hidden activity going on that I have to be aware of or suspicious of, but it's externalized. It's not internalized. Um, and I think this is American psychology, for example, that the lack of introspection actually gives rise to so much paranoid thinking. So yes, it's always a possibility, but I tend to think that the more you actually, let's say, practice this, the less the paranoid possibilities.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there is something about a lack of the fear of the hidden and more of a kind of openness and curiosity that I find in myself, and hopefully I can help lead the people I work with to that kind of attitude, that kind of curiosity. Because, like you said, if we do the seeing through and we do the activity of psychologizing, it does have this opening effect. And I think like ultimately freedom, like I mentioned last time that have started to see Hillman's psychology as a type of yoga. And I was reflecting on it this morning. It's like, who is attracted to these ideas and this way of working? And I think like, for me, definitely, it's people who seek freedom, and I think like the people that I meet who are into Hillman's ideas are lovers of freedom and are real free thinkers and are comfortable being in a place of uncertainty, ambiguity, ambivalence. They're people who like the kind of defined solid ground feels like a kind of a prison or something,
Yeah.
right? Rather than like making you more comfortable, having some kind of certainty. The final answer, like the final answer to me does feel constricting rather than comforting.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could be too that the flip side of the perception of a hidden meaning is the posture of curiosity that people who are curious, they want to understand more about something. Um, and I one of the examples of seeing through I often use is an experience that I had. A very small experience, but it's stayed with me, which is, going back a few years, I used to like to take my work, student papers to the coffee shop I'm one of those people who does okay with that sort of ambient noise. And there were two coffee shops that I like to go to. One was the local Starbucks. And then the other was a privately owned in the store, sort of funkier down in the industrial part of town. And I got into this micro neurosis every time I walked into the Starbucks. This tape would set off. Oh, you're giving all your money to the multinational corporation when you could be giving it to the little business down the street. And this wasn't a big deal, but I just noticed it for a while and just sort of a little uneasiness. And until one day, the when I walked into the Starbucks, an image came to me, which was this is the town square.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm.
and and then that tension went away because I could see the archetypal value. This was the place where I'd occasionally see people I knew coming in and out. I got to know the baristas and so forth. Now, I suppose that because we were talking about paranoia and so forth, I suppose that could have gone a different way, which is that if I had not been so psychologizing about that feeling, maybe I would have ended up in a paranoid fantasy about the multinational corporations sort of victimizing us and extracting things. And I mean, there's a whole other way to go with that feeling that got set off. Yeah. So
Yeah, and then you would have been in like a position of defensiveness to this thing, right? And
right.
maybe into some kind of heroic fantasy that I'm only going to go to the independently owned coffee shop because I'm a righteous guy and this is what righteous guys do and against the man and the corporation and all that, right?
That's right. I could have gotten caught at a whole sort of sociological level. But now notice that the image of the town square, that's a kind of archetypal image. If you've been to Europe, all the towns have the squares, and this is where people socialize and so forth.
Yeah, Latin America
But
too.
it's not an answer, right? We were
Hmm.
talking about it's not an explanation, it's just an image, it's a metaphor. But somehow that was satisfying to my situation.
Yeah, and one of the things that he continually points to is this type of attitude or approach uh, isn't moralistic, unlike some psychologies. So the town square isn't better than the out of the way underground speakeasy type coffee shop where maybe
Right?
the socialists gather, or,
Right.
it's not better, it's different.
It's
And
different.
yeah, and it has its own value because at the Starbucks, I might see people that I would never see at the out of the way coffee shop, and vice versa. And
Yes.
so they both have their value and their place.
Yeah.
And so it takes me out of this dualistic conflict.
Right. And notice how it stays with the whatness. right? The whatness of the
What
experience,
is this like?
yeah,
Mhm.
versus the abstract thinking around, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the Starbucks is like a square,
Hmm.
and the independent coffee shop is like a speakeasy or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can enjoy both of those actually.
Sure.
I might be
Yeah.
in the mood for one or the other, depending.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's a question of, figuring out like what is the value, what is the hidden value of something that I'm drawn towards. And sometimes when you see through to that, then you're not as compelled, or it could go differently. But nonetheless, what Hillman's underscoring is that seeing through is itself an action of substantive measure. It's not just something floating in and out of your mind, because that revelation or that insight immediately works at the behavioral level.
Yeah, and I think the emotional level too,
Hmm.
because I might have a different feeling about Starbucks if I can see through and see that it's like something like a town square. Um, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
one of the things that I pulled out of this chapter that I thought was an important idea is the alienation of the soul.
Hmm.
And just even that phrase to me is really evocative. And so when he's talking about the alienation of the soul, um, I think what he's talking about is that the soul is often alienated from conventional psychologies, and that the conventional psychology tends not to speak in the language of the soul, in images and metaphor, but it speaks in a scientific cause and effect kind of language of modern science. And so, if we don't even have a language of the soul, or even the idea of soul in our culture anymore, then the soul feels alienated or is alienated.
Hmm. Yes, yeah. Yeah, a great example would be all the ways in which nowadays we think of the mind as a computer. That's
Mm,
that's the dominant metaphor, and then that leads to all kinds of ways of thinking about the mind, our thoughts. Are our thoughts really just information, for example, just data, which can then be swapped out? That there's no rootedness to where our thinking comes from. There's none of that in-betweenness of soul. The soul is something between body and mind, for example. It's something between spirit and matter. Um, so you lose all of that with these more flat, explanatory fantasies, really,
mm.
about how the mind is working.
Yeah, right. That's another aspect of the alienation. So he talks about like what you're saying, if we lose the kind of the traditional or historic idea of soul,
Mhm.
then well, I'll just quote him. Then we borrow alien perspectives regarding ourselves as consumers, computers, or apes,
Mhm.
right? So he talks about it as if we lose the idea of soul, it fosters an overactive soul without an idea of itself to be grounded in something else. Then we're kind of yeah subjected to thinking of yeah our mind as a computer and processing, or as neurological pathways only, and neurochemical models of mind and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the soul has to be fed, and if it's not fed with rich ideas that help us insight our lives, then it's going to go like grab on to, some bright, shiny object, psychologically speaking. the loudest voice, the cult leader with the most charisma, the new age system that seems easy and so contemporary, whatever it is. Um, but quite often, people then are still hungry, and so this turns into a kind of compulsive circle. And I think we all know the look of someone who is uh, grounded in their sense of soul. They're fed by ordinary everyday experiences and ordinary everyday creativity versus the need to go, right, grabbing these other substitute systems, poor substitutes.
Yeah, that's great. I've been working out my own language around, like Hillman loves the phrase soul making.
Hmm.
And that doesn't ever quite sit right with me because it still kind of, I think, can have the tendency of putting you in this egoic perspective of like, all this stuff I'm doing, my dream work and sand play or whatever it is, I'm
Uh-huh.
making soul, you know? And I've been just trying to think about it more like what I really appreciate is soulfulness.
Mhm.
And so that maybe brings me more toward the feeding the soul
Mhm.
idea rather than
Mhm.
making soul. Like
Mhm.
my soul is hungry for, all of this stuff that we've been talking about, the soulful ideas, psychological ideas, metaphor. And so if I feed my soul that, I become more soulful. And I go, well, what are the qualities that I would describe to someone who, I think of as soulful? And one of the things is this groundedness that you're speaking of,
Mhm.
that sense of being at home in oneself, of being at home in the world, in experience,
Mhm.
something like that, and that kind of expansiveness that allows someone to not fall into duality or defensiveness and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of those things are getting toward what I'm talking about when I'm talking about soulfulness.
And I can see that trap in the term soul making you're talking about. Even these four parts of revisioning, sometimes people latch onto them, they think of them more as ego techniques, that these are uh, things we can do, right? And the more we do this from a willful place. But Hillman's really describing currents that are already part of the soul. Um, and what he's suggesting is that we try to align our own perspectives, our own ways of thinking to these currents that are evident. So I think the life place here, in contrast to that ego position, is to remember the idea of soul as a perspective, and then soul making becomes a honing, a constant honing of that perspective. Um, and I think it also goes with the idea that of maybe the fantasy of soul as an opus, a lifelong opus. And
Yeah,
so how do you keep working on your ways of seeing, your modes of being present to life, um, feeding your ideas and insights and so forth. That all of this is the business, in a sense, of soul making.
yeah, yeah, that's great. I like this idea of looking at your life as a kind of magnum opus, as something that really has no end. And I think that's what you're pointing to is that trap that we can still bring certain ideas into an examination of James Hillman's work, right? Like somebody could look at revisioning psychology as a kind of textbook for archetypal psychology or soul making
Yeah.
and bring with it the idea that if I just perform these actions or
Mhm.
make this a practice, then I will what? Eradicate my shadow and like integrate all my archetypes and I will become whole. Right? And I've heard variations of that when it comes to archetypal psychology. So that's still getting into what he cautions against, or what he is kind of railing against, this notion that there's always, first the why and then the how.
Yes,
Right?
yes. Well, system was a word he really didn't like. So
Yeah.
he's constantly
Program and
moving
system.
away from systems and formulas, and if you look at, his own opus of writings, it's very much here and here and here, and he just jumps about. But the common thread is the way of seeing. It's the style of being psychological. And so I think the prophylactic against what you're describing, getting too formulaic, is the idea that soul is about turning events into experiences, and we can't control events. Events come to us in life. And so it is an ongoing uh, process of how to meet the things that show up with this more soulful way of looking.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and what that gets you is not wholeness or peace, or like no conflict or no reactivity, something like that. But what it gets you is more soul.
Yes, more soul, more depth, more character, uh, perhaps more eccentricity.
Hmm.
You become more weird rather than less weird, but something is emerging that is aside from your sort of worldly prosaic point of view. And I think that points to, the last chapter also.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things that he's always kind of dancing with in his work in general, but in this book very specifically, is the dance between psychology and religion, or psychology and theology.
Mhm.
So let's get into that.
Okay.
It's a big topic,
Mhm.
but let me just pull out this quote. This might be helpful. So it's the subheading, "There are gods in our ideas." He
Mhm.
says, archetypal psychology envisions the fundamental ideas of the psyche to be expressions of persons: hero, nymph, mother, senex, child, trickster, Amazon, puer, and many other specific prototypes bearing the names and stories of the gods. These are the root metaphors. And the note on this quotation goes to Gaston Bachelard. And I
Mhm.
think this is great. I just picked up on this in my last read through, actually. But he says that root metaphor is itself a metaphor, which is like, it's metaphors all the way down, right?
Yes, right. Right.
But I like this, and he says he got this from Bachelard, that the idea of root metaphor belongs to the imagination of the element earth, so that when we can discover a root metaphor, we gain the conviction that we have come upon an idea that is basic, grounded, solid, and supportive.
Yes,
I love that.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, so seeing through to the God within the emotion, the symptom, whatever's going on,
Mhm.
gives us a grounding in something that's much older, deeper than our personal self.
Well, here I like to kind of step back a little bit to the to some of Jung's thinking that Hillman, picks up on. And what Jung saw is that part of the spiritual problem of modernity was that the spirituality was so removed from our actual psychological experience. And then we had this very abstract religion with gods that seem elsewhere and focused on an afterlife rather than on this life. And that what he saw emerging in the modern psyche was a sort of demand for a spiritual point of view or a religious posture that brought a sense of uh, this realm into everyday life. Um, and so when you have, as Hillman presents us, a psychology of the gods, quote unquote, where the gods are not metaphysical entities so much as psychic realities, yet still point to something ultimate, then you get a psychology that hasn't split off from religion. And you could then say you get a religion that is sort of psychological. Now, maybe you call it a pagan religion, but I think it's better just to think of it as a religion of everyday experience,
Mhm.
wherein the religious posture, and again, this is something Jung put on the table, digging into the root of the term religion and saying what is religion in its essence? It's the careful taking account of the forces that impact upon us. Well, if we're imagining those forces in archetypal terms as gods, we could say that being religious is paying attention to the gods, paying attention to where the gods show up in everyday life. And now all of a sudden you have a psychology that's not split from from religion.
Mhm. Yeah, and that a polytheistic religion better accounts for or reflects the what um, the varieties of experience, maybe, right?
Yes, yes, exactly. Because the more monotheistic, in a sense, the more abstract your God image is, because it has to kind of cover all things. But the advantage of the sort of pagan religious imagination is that there's a god, or there's an ancestor, or there's a spirit for every aspect of life and every kind of experience. Whether you can name that or not is in a way secondary to the idea that, oh, there's a god in that little creature that just popped out at me as I was walking down the path. There's a little sign there, or there's a God in the symptom, as we talked about last time, and that then, to sort of come full 60 with what we were talking about, if there's a divine value or a divine spark in these small everyday things, then you pay attention in a different way. You want to look deeper. You want to say, "Oh, what is this? What's going on? What might this be saying to me?"
hmm hmm Yeah, and you may value the world in a different way, right? Rather than it's just a great resource for our use, for our exploitation, for our convenience, whatever. Yeah, I think like polytheistic paganism is the solution to our climate crisis. Like
Hmm.
without that relational love for the personified world, I don't think we're just going to get there. I don't think fear of destruction is actually enough.
Right.
Weirdly, you think that would be it, and people have been ringing that bell for decades. At least since the 50s about the collapse of oil and global warming and the ozone layer and all that stuff, and it hasn't changed people's behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. That all of the practical scientific arguments don't speak to the soul, and so they don't move us on an imaginal or an emotional level. Um,
Right,
but
like what you said earlier, like what actually changes behavior,
yeah, what
right?
changes behavior? Yep.
You gotta awaken the soul, you gotta move the soul, you gotta stir the soul in order for real change to happen, I
Mhm.
think. I've
Yeah.
seen that.
Yeah, I think a term that is probably quite opposite to a sense of soul would be the term commodity. And when we turn the world and now, as I've argued recently, ourselves into commodities, um, then you're in a utilitarian fantasy. You're using things. You're focusing on the instrumentality. You're not focusing on what uh, like where your sense of life and vitality can be expanded, and where you might learn a different kind of empathic regard.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, this does lead us right into the final chapter on dehumanizing.
Hmm.
And people will hear that term and go, what? Dehumanizing is bad, right? But the way I take it, what he means by this is more depersonalizing our psychology, not making it all about me. And, you know, this kind of like ownership that, let's say, conventional mainstream psychology has us, owning our emotions, owning our experiences, our truth, our this, our that, right? And that feelings are facts. And you got to trust your feelings, trust your gut, all these kind of things. He's just like kind of pulling the rug out from under that idea.
Yes. Yeah, and it begins with the basic phenomenological view of psychological experience that any kind of deep emotion, profound idea, image, or fantasy, we experience these things as though they come to us from somewhere else. Uh, of course, what we then do with them is our business, is our kind of responsibility, but we're not the source of these things. Um, and so I think a way to think about this whole final chapter is that the soul doesn't belong to us. And he says something tantamount to that. There's a very evocative passage where he's saying the soul is on loan to us for a while. And where he
Us being the kind of the egoic consciousness.
the
Yeah.
the ego, and we're here to do for it what we can. So it sort of reverses the habitual fantasy that we find ourselves in, particularly in American culture, that our spirituality, our soul searching, and is all for our own enrichment, to enrich our lives. But what about if we think, well, maybe we're here to do something for the soul? Maybe we're here to take account of what is pushing up from the psyche and trying to make its way into life to renew our sense of values and so forth. So, he says there, it's the ancestors, maybe it's something in the zeitgeist, but it's something else. It's not us. Um, and it's a very radical perspective. As you say, I think it's best to think of it as depersonalizing, because dehumanizing is a big term. But there's also another point in the text where he says, it's like a little secret key. He says, my point about dehumanizing is in order for us to rehumanize in a different way.
Hmm.
And this is right before he goes into talking about the Renaissance, where there's this great reimagining of what it means to be human, which is much more cosmological. And so we can kind of hang on to that little tidbit.
Hmm. Yeah, it rehumanizes us in a different way. Yeah, because I think what it's pointing to is that, in our current, let's say, dominant mindset of the West and beyond, really, like what's the West anymore? I mean, this thinking is spread everywhere, but that it's human centric, it's anthropocentric.
Yes.
And the human is at the center of everything, and everything is about me and for me and all of that. And this isn't the way it's always been. And this is the way a lot of people in the world, they don't think that way. They see, that the world as having as much value and differentiation as the kind of the human species.
Mhm. Mhm.
And yeah, maybe the human is in service to that. So yeah, rehumanizing in a different way, I think is a good way to put it. And yeah, he does point to the Neoplatonists and the Renaissance as people who embodied a different kind of attitude. And
Right.
what I found was interesting, and what jumped out at me in this read through, is that what he was kind of pointing to with this Renaissance attitude, it wouldn't, like, taking on a kind of a polytheistic imagination of the world doesn't put you in conflict with a monotheistic religion. And I hadn't really noticed that point before, but there's something to that. And he points to somebody like Marsilio Ficino, who was what? He was a, I don't know, I guess he identified as a Catholic, right? But was this,
Oh yeah, very much part of that tradition, but also tapped into this whole other Greek stream, and the burgeoning embrace of the imaginal in relationship to the body, the earth. Yeah, so there's a whole other sensibility going on there.
yeah, if you're not caught up in literalism, it allows you that polytheistic worldview, because you're dealing with it imaginally or metaphorically, which is no less real. So it takes a kind of a turning of the mind to be able to
Yes.
value the imaginal as much as you do the quote unquote real.
Yeah, this is very important because sometimes people read Hillman too literally and think that he's really bashing Christianity or other forms of monotheistic faith. And what he's critiquing is a style of consciousness, uh, the monotheistic style, which wants to like hang on to absolutes and sweeping dogmas and so forth. But you can still participate in a faith with a polytheistic style of consciousness. For example, you can pay more attention to the fact that, even in the sacred text, God shows up in a number of different ways. It might be the one God, but that God has many different faces, many different guises, many different presentations, and you can focus on that multiplicity rather than on the sort of abstract umbrella qualities.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a good point that it's a, what did you say, a monotheistic attitude or frame of mind,
Mhm.
perspective,
Style of consciousness, yeah.
style of consciousness, right? And that doesn't just only apply to religion. He also talks about the monotheism of even Jung's
Yeah.
psychology in a way, as being, the self as the kind of the one, or the nous, or right.
Yes, if you get too caught in what Hillman liked to call the unitive fantasy, and then you lose touch with all of the different archetypal um, but there again, it's all about the way you read Jung. And this gets back to a psychology of perspective. It's not about what things are in and of themselves. It's about the way we imagine into things, the way we're holding them psychologically.
Hmm. Yeah, I thought this statement was great. The religion that psychology requires must reflect the state of the soul as it is, actual psychic reality. That means polytheism. Like he's just like declarative statement. Look, if this is what we're looking to do, it requires a polytheism. For the soul's inherent multiplicity demands a theological fantasy of equal differentiation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. And I think for anyone listening to your podcast, they've probably already crossed this threshold, but they realize that uh, if they're going to have a spiritual orientation, let's call it, it has to speak directly to that multiplicity of actual lived experience. We can no longer, most people at any rate, can't tolerate a spirituality that is uh, separate from that lived experience because that just leads to repression and dissociation and that's not workable.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think like even Christianity couldn't tolerate it because Christianity, at least in its Catholic form, became more and more, maybe not polytheistic, but poly in a lot of ways, with the ordination of all the saints who, there's a saint for everything, just like there used to be a God for everything, right? So you're experiencing something in your life, well, there's a saint to turn to. I mean, that's pretty kind of like polytheistic in a way,
Well, I suppose
or
if
psychologically
would
polytheistic anyway.
yeah, yeah, right. I'll probably be struck by lightning for saying this, but the sin of Christianity, if you will, is also the sin of literalism.
Mhm.
That and Hillman really goes to town on this in a chapter that's in the book Interviews uh,
Mhm.
that has the title A Running Engagement with Christianity because he acknowledges that he's constantly looking at this, but what he underscores there is that he's attacking unconscious Christianity that's just accepted as a sort of worldview that's the default. And one of the problems is that Christianity takes its mythic elements literally. It lives myths, insisting they're not myths. And from this more psychological point of view, that's a real difficulty. You've lost then the whole sort of metaphorical and imaginal, and even in Jung, symbolical way of relating to a religious tradition.
Yeah, and I think like his biggest complaint was with the Protestant Reformation and Protestantism, which
Mhm.
does away with all the things that flourished in Catholicism, the saints, the icons, the Trinity, all of that stuff, right?
Mhm.
And so he saw like kind of modern psychology as Protestant, so like a specific form of Christian thinking, right?
Well, you could look at it like this, that all of those stories of the saints, the iconography, the rituals, the whole rich apparatus of Catholicism is a form of polytheism.
Yeah.
In other words, how do you get to the one God? You get to the one God through all of these different intercessionary, uh,
Well, those that you can relate to, just like the deities in Hinduism, right? Like
exactly.
it
Yeah.
always has to be relational. It has to engage your heart and your mind.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think for it to be effective. right? For it
Yeah,
actually to link you, it has to be a linking through. You have to be bound by love.
right.
And so, the one God, I got no image for him except, well, oh, no, I've got Jesus. Okay, well, there's Jesus, right? But there's also, maybe I don't relate to Jesus so well, but like Saint Patrick, wow, man, I really love that guy, you know?
Well, the problem with Protestantism is that it stripped back all of that,
Yeah,
and then you just have you and the Bible. So the monotheism is that it's you and the Bible. It's just the Bible. And then, of course, all the arguments about interpreting the Bible led to, well, you need to take the Bible literally. There aren't these different readings, there aren't these different interpretations. There's just what it says. Well, this is a whole example of this monotheistic consciousness, um, which you see is a psychology. That's the
hmm,
point that Hellman's making, that there's a psychology in our religion, and then there's a kind of religion in our psychology. If we put on the right glasses to see that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. When religion is functioning, there's no need for psychology. Like, so what we know as psychology only emerged after Nietzsche's Death of God. Like,
Yeah.
it comes directly out of that as a response to some kind of need in the society and culture.
Yeah, the symbolic system breaks down, and then we're in a sense exposed to the raw realities of these archetypal energies, and out of this comes a whole different way of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, what you said made me think of another quote that I pulled. The soul's multiplicities need adequate archetypal containers, or like fallen angels in a maze, they wander in anarchy.
Mm.
And so, whether those archetypal containers come from religion or from an archetypal psychology, we need them, obviously, right? Or we fall prey to ideology and gurus and addiction and all the other ways that the religious impulse finds a way to try to get satisfied.
Well, we started out talking about ideas, and we need the idea of gods because certain fantasies take hold of us uh, as 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 gods, as powers that are beyond us. And we see this every day now in American life. The grip of these fantasies, paranoid fantasies about immigrants destroying our way of life, um, fantasies about conspiracy theories and the deep state. I mean, the psychic energy these things have uh, are like gods acting upon us, and we're sort of flailing about. And so when you're in a egocentric or personalistic idea, that that's what's dominating your way of understanding things, then you're a victim to all of these greater powers because you don't have this psychological ideas to see through that, to actually look at the phenomenon and say, oh, that's an overwhelming idea. Where does that come from? Um, you see, the
Hmm.
seeing through process in a strange way gives us more moves to make.
Hmm.
Uh, and we're not then a victim of these like overwhelming ideas. Yes, the autonomy of the animal popping in at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she knew we were about to close up here.
Hmm.
Yeah, this has been great. I mean, I hope that people listening aren't too overwhelmed by us, kind of skimming through some of these ideas or jumping from one to the other.
No.
I would suggest that anybody who's like even intrigued by some of what we've been talking about is to go to the text
Right.
um, and read it slowly and underline everything because you probably will.
Well, it's probably better if we have done this to entice rather than
Yeah.
explain, right?
Yeah.
And, uh,
Yeah.
and then there's a door to go through, and hopefully people do have an experience of like, oh, I want to think more on this and ponder, and that then the thoughts are moving rather than static. Oh, I've got I understand this all
Yeah.
of a sudden. And I think that's what Hellman's aiming for, and that's why he uses these verb terms all the time, like soul making. It's an ongoing process. It's not a set of answers.
Yeah. And he does stress that in the book when he's talking about ideas that ideas are action oriented. Yeah. And I think like for me, kind of living this out or wrestling with these ideas happens like best in conversation,
Mm.
because I find like different things stand out to different people. People, because he's not so cut and dry and clear and all of that, people can interpret things differently, which again is kind of psychologizing. It's opening, right?
Yeah.
And so I was mentioning to you before, I think like after doing this with you, I'm inspired to maybe try to put together like a reading group or study group around this
Mm.
text
Mm.
and really take it slow and open it up as a dialogue. What does it bring up in people? What are they noticing? Because there's so much here in this text that I just I can't. I'm not done with it. And you've been working with it for such a long time. I mean, like when I was rereading it this time, I was just struck by how alive his ideas make me feel. You know,
Yes.
and I don't have that experience reading most psychological texts, you know, even Jung.
Yeah.
But when I read Hillman, I feel this sense of aliveness and kind of excitement. I don't know. Do you still get that? Did you ever have that?
Oh, I do, and like you, I reread this text frequently, um, and I think the key to understanding that is that Hillman knew that what he was talking about, he was doing as he was writing.
Right. Yeah.
You see?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
then you're reading it and you have
Yes.
your own experiences of seeing through, deepening, thinking about things differently, opening up the imagination. He's not just talking about
Yeah.
that. It's he's enabling that as you're reading through the text, and I think because it is so rich, people's minds go in all kinds of directions, but nonetheless, there's a stream. It's moving somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. You put words to something I was feeling earlier that the text is impossible to summarize, or that a summary doesn't do it service,
Mm.
because like you're saying, the reading of the text is an experience. It's
Hmm.
not just an event that can be
Hmm.
summarized and bullet pointed, but it's an experience that if you're open to it and you follow him, that I think it will change you. It is a kind of a yoga, and I'll keep coming back to that, but if you follow him, if you're able to follow him, it will change the way that you see the world and think about yourself and the world and all of that.
Yeah,
Like it is a kind of an alchemical text in some ways.
yeah. And to me, the ultimate value of Hillman is, yes, you can immerse yourself in his ideas, really take on archetypal psychology as your point of orientation or main source of psychological thinking, but you can also work with the perspective that Hellman's laying out in relationship to any other psychology, including Jung. I say this to my students because some of them, not sure about Hillman, others just dive right in. But even when you're sort of pretty attached to the classic Jungian idea, Hillman can help you look at those ideas in a different way and hold them uh, more loosely, less dogmatically, perhaps, less literally.
Yeah. And then there are some who are looking for a dogma. And Hillman
Yes,
won't be for you. He'll upset the apple cart.
that's true. That's
Yeah.
true.
Well, I thought what you were going to say is that you can look at Hillman as a kind of a spiritual guru, which
I
I th
wouldn't.
I think I can in this way, in that he
Okay.
can help you free your help. What's the right way to put it? I don't want to say help you free yourself from conditioning or something like that, but it is something like that.
Uh-huh.
Like I think that his ideas can have that effect, the same effect that I've gotten through study with yoga gurus.
Uh-huh.
The
Uh-huh.
same thing is happening. It is like a deconstruction in a way, but uh, Hillman, I mean, I think there's something covert about him in that he is does act like a kind of a guru, um, even though he would never claim that or want that. But I think his ideas have can have that effect on someone.
Well, to me, he's someone, and I knew him for the last decade or so of his life. Um, he walked his talk, and his talk has to do with like bringing things in, and he attributes a lot of what he says to other streams of thinking. So he's kind of channeling something. He doesn't talk about himself at all in what he writes. So
Hmm.
he's modeling the way of thinking that he's describing.
Yeah, yeah. And Tom Moore's talked to me about how, like Hillman loved to go shopping at like Neiman Marcus or wherever, it's very conventional department stores. But Tom said that he would love going shopping with Hillman because it was this experience of the gods in the mundane world, you know, like picking out a tie and talking, about Venus or whatever it was, and so like I mean, after kind of hearing that and immersing myself in his ideas, I used to have like such an aversion to going to the shopping mall. And then a couple of years, I wanted to get a particular something, and I had to go to the mall. It was the only place I could go. And I remember walking in there, and my experience of it was so different than, you know, what it was years before, where I would have been like, oh, the mall, it's so all this like corporate crap and consumerism and all these people walking around like zombies and all this stuff. But I've walked in there and I was like, there's like a freshness to the place. I loved walking by all of the different stores and looking at the window displays. And I loved how like all of the women in the shopping mall were all kind of gussied up and they looked so pretty. And I was like, the shopping mall is like the last surviving temple to Aphrodite. It's a completely different experience. I think that's what I'm getting at is that it can really change you in the way that you relate to the world.
I think that's a wonderful example, maybe to end on, because you're describing the way you put on a different set of glasses that could imagine into something so ordinary, so profane in many respects, in other ways of seeing, and yet then it comes to life, and then you have a different experience, and you're relating then to that aspect of life in a completely different manner. And I think that's what Hellman is all about.
Mm. Yeah, and the why, where does this all lead to? Again, coming back to like what I think of when I think of what it means to be soulful, a key word here is enjoyment. Not
Mhm.
some transcendent joy, but enjoyment, which is about enjoying in the body, something like that, you know? And I think a deeper enjoyment of life. That's what it gives me anyway. And that's not a bad thing to have.
That's
Forget
very
enlightenment. I want more enjoyment.
yes, that's definitely true. That's just enough of these sparks and the soul is satisfied. It doesn't have to be happy all the time. It doesn't. Nothing has to be perfect. But there are these openings. There are these insights. There are these joys. Maybe that's enough.
I think so. Thanks so much, Glenn. Really
Okay.
appreciate you. And we'll see if there's an excuse to talk to you again down the road.
All right.
I hope
Okay.
so.
Look forward to it.
All right. Take care.